Gospodine Marfi, na početku da vam se zahvalim što govorite za Radio Slobodna Evropa, pa krenut ćemo odmah od posljednjih zbivanja. Jučer je održana preskonferencija nakon sjednice Vijeća za provođenje mira. Rečeno je, barem tako je visoki predstavnik predstavio, da se međunarodna zajednica uslovno rečeno neće miješati vezano za državnu imovinu u smislu nekog nametanja, ali istovremeno rekao i to da međunarodna će zajednica proaktivno djelovati u narednom periodu. Na šta se to konkretno mislilo?
Well, I think it means a couple different things. Let me start with state property. The High Representative emphasized that this is part of the 5+2 process. And in order for OHR to close down and for the High Rep to leave Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have to implement and complete the 5+2 process. And state property is one of those outstanding conditions. And what the High Rep was signaling, I think, and what the PIC was signaling, is that we're going to engage more on this to try to push this towards a conclusion. And the High Rep indicated that he did not want to impose a final state property law. That's right. I don't think we want to see a final imposition of a state property law either. But there is an urgency associated with state property because with the latest Constitutional Court decision defining use as or disposal as even temporary use of property, it has the potential to threaten investments here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? Because an investor needs to be able to make use of property, and the blockage on state property by the political leaders is going to prevent that for a reputable investor, right? For someone like a Western investor, a European investor, a transatlantic investor. So the High Rep is right that there needs to be more activism there. And the United States welcomes that. We support the High Representative's mandate here, as everyone knows, and we support his use of the bond powers when necessary.
Ali evo, upravo ste rekli, visoki predstavnik se neće miješati u nametanje tog pitanja i istovremeno da se vlasti oko toga trebaju dogovoriti. Ali zaista vjerujete da se oni mogu dogovoriti ako se nisu mogli dogovoriti u proteklih 20 godina po pitanju državne imovine?
Well, that's a good question. I have to confess I'm not terribly optimistic that there's going to be an agreement in the near term on state property. You have two positions that are diametrically opposed to one another, and some of which are at odds with the facts, and which aren't going to lead us towards compromise. I mean, in the RS, they maintain that there's no such thing as state property; the property belongs to the entities. That's patently false. On the other side, their argument is state property forevermore, and there's no prospect of distribution of state property to an entity, to a canton, to a municipality. So, for example, you condemn the armed forces of BiH to holding on to a piece of property it doesn't need, it doesn't want, isn't necessary for the military in any way, shape, or form, and they have to devote resources to maintaining and guarding it. That's silly. You should give it away or transfer it to an entity or to a canton or to a municipality that can make better use of it. Those two extreme positions are entirely problematic. Now, look, the international community's patience has limits. The High Representative's patience has limits. There is a long-term need for a state property piece of legislation to address the whole issue. There's also an immediate concern that we all have in the international community about investments and infrastructure investments, green energy investments. The Quarter 5C and the implications of the current court rulings on whether or not that's legal. And they need to be addressed. That's an immediate need, and I think the High Rep is prepared to address those concerns if the parties are not.
Kažete da je međunarodna zajednica zabrinuta. Jesu li BiH političari, mislite, zabrinuti zato što upravo zbog tog problema nema investicija?
I think it depends on which politician you're talking to, right? When we talk to municipal leaders, they're very concerned. They're closest to the people. Their communities are the ones that suffer most when the solar panels can't be put up, when the windmills can't be put up, when the road can't be widened, or whatever the case may be. And so I think they're quite concerned. I think the higher up you go, the less concerned people get, and the more political this gets in a negative way, and people are less inclined to find solutions.
Odmah nakon što je završena preskonferencija reagovala je ruska ambasada. To ću morati da citiram zbog toga što su rekli, odnosno saopštili, kako fitilj bombe može biti pitanje državne imovine, te da svima koji naivno pričaju o suverenitetu i teritorijalnom integritetu Bosne i Hercegovine odgovaramo, zapamtite ovaj dan. Smatrate li vi ovo prijetnjom Rusije?
I think short answer is yes. But I think Russia has demonstrated clearly and repeatedly throughout the world, in Europe and in the Western Balkans, that its malign influence is a problem, right? And that's true here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Western Balkans as well. It's quite clear that one of the things Russia does not want is an independent, economically prosperous Bosnia and Herzegovina inside the European Union or the Euro-Atlantic community of nations, for example. It doesn't want energy independence for Bosnia and Herzegovina. And there's a reason for that. They want to maintain their capacity to blackmail, politically and economically, the country. And they've shut the gas off here, for example, and they've used energy as a weapon, and they've exerted malign influence in other parts of Europe as well. That's how we know they do this. I mean, for example, and all this is getting worse, and I want to give you a specific example, not just the statement and the threats. Not that long ago, it was uncovered and discovered that the Russians were operating a camp run by Russian paramilitary organizations or military companies in Republika Srpska to train individuals to disrupt the Moldovan elections, an EU candidate country, just like BiH. That's extremely serious. It tells you just how brazen the Russians are, how dangerous the Russians are, and the individuals who allowed that to happen should be held accountable for allowing that to happen. And it should be an issue of concern for all of the citizens of BiH, not just the political leaders, and obviously for countries like the United States and others in the transatlantic community of nations.
Ko su ti pojedinci o kojima govorite i dovoljno ste dugo u Bosni i Hercegovini da možete reći da li se plašite tog ruskog uticaja posebno u kontekstu veza koje ima predsjednik Republike Srpske Milorad Dodik sa ruskim predsjednikom Vladimirom Putinom i uopšte sa predstavnicima Rusije ovdje u Bosni i Hercegovini?
Well, look, I think it's very clear that Mr. Dodik in particular and others in senior government positions in the RS have sided with, gotten into bed with, become essentially proxies of, you pick your metaphor or your language, with Russia, right? And that's a mistake for a number of reasons. One, Russia's behavior towards its proxies and towards countries is entirely malign, right? Two, it takes the country further away from the aspirations of its citizens, including those who live in Republika Srpska, to join the European Union, for example. I mean, the European Union just opened up the opportunity to move further down the process of joining the EU with candidate status a year and a half, 2 years ago, and then the accession negotiations conditioned on additional reforms. Getting in bed with Russia and embracing its agenda, whether in Ukraine or in Georgia or here in the Western Balkans, is completely at odds with that vision of the future which the people of this country want. So it's a risk to the future of the businesses in the RS, the citizens in the RS, and of course everyone living in the Federation as well. It's a risk to the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I think no individual in Europe has visited Moscow or Russia more than Milorad Dodik in the last year. He seems to send a high-level delegation up there, or two, every month, other than when they're on summer leave or campaigning. I think that tells you something about where his allegiances lie. And I think it should say something to people in Mostar and Sarajevo and Zagreb, in Brussels, in Washington and Berlin and Paris about what it is we have as a problem here and what we need to deal with. Because you can't bring into the European Union a country that is ruled autocratically by a Russian proxy. It's just not possible.
Sjedinjene Američke Države su imale odgovor na to. Gospodin Dodik je pod američkim sankcijama, ali čini se da odgovor nema Evropska unija. Možda samo Njemačka koja je stopirala projekte u Republici Srpskoj. Kako gledate na to?
Well, look, we think sanctions are a very important and valuable tool to hold accountable individuals or companies that have engaged in anti-date and corrupt or other behaviors and activities that are destabilizing to Bosnia and Herzegovina, right? We have been very clear, and I have made it a priority of mine during my time here to make sure that we're responding clearly and quickly to this type of behavior. And I think that's an important change in U.S. policy that's made a difference here. No one's laughing about our sanctions anymore. That's the first point I'd like to make. Obviously, we would like to see our allies and partners make use of similar tools where they have them to hold individuals accountable for this kind of behavior, because all of us have a strategic interest in supporting the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina and seeing the country integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions. Now, we don't all have the same tools, right? And there are challenges with using these tools in different places, in different capitals, and we understand and respect that. I think the most important thing for me is that when it comes down to the strategic objectives that Washington has and the strategic objectives that Brussels has, they're the same.
Bosna i Hercegovina je zavisna i od ruskog gasa, jer ide preko turskog toka i dolazi preko turskog toka u Bosnu i Hercegovinu. Američka administracija evo godinama insistira da se usvoji zakon o južnoj interkonekciji. Vi ste imali sastanak jučer sa parlamentarcima u Federaciji BiH, ali ne i sa predstavnicima HDZ-a. Recite mi zašto HDZ nije pozvan na sastanak?
Well, we decided, Washington decided that they wanted to discuss with the parliamentarians who have this legislation in front of them, who are interested in supporting its adoption, how they might do that, and discuss the urgency and the need to adopt the Southern Interconnection legislation, because we're concerned about the dependence on Russian gas and the exposure to Russian blackmail, political and economic blackmail, that portends. We've seen the Russians cut off the gas here before, and we've seen them cut off gas and use energy as a weapon all across Europe. So we have allies and partners in the world, right? Like Bosnia and Herzegovina. My government does not want to see our allies and partners exposed to that kind of bullying and intimidation. It's bad for the partner and the ally, of course, in this case Bosnia and Herzegovina and its citizens, but it's also bad for us. It's in our strategic interest to have those people we're close to free of the potential of Russian blackmail. And so we discussed that issue, as well as the need to act to end that. You know, look, Russian malign influence in the region has gotten worse, particularly since 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine. It's not just a challenge in BiH, it's a challenge in Europe as a whole and in the Western Balkans as well. As I said earlier, they don't want to see and want to get in the way of Bosnia and Herzegovina's journey towards the Euro-Atlantic community of nations. And I think you heard in the Russian ambassador's statement, which you mentioned earlier in the interview, what it is I'm talking about. We had a meeting. I want to stress it was a meeting, just not dissimilar to what we're doing now. We had a conversation about an issue, and the issue was BiH's energy independence. And the Russian ambassador's reaction to that meeting was to threaten the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Think about that for a moment. Think about how serious that is. That tells you something about how much they want to retain their monopoly on gas supply for their own nefarious and malign purposes, right? It was a clear expression of intent and malign influence. My country supports the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, irrespective of what's going on in the domestic political scene here. You have a meeting the Russian ambassador doesn't like, and his response is to threaten the territorial integrity of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I mean, I'm grateful that he said what he said, because it exposed for everyone to see what the so-called friendship with Russia and BiH actually amounts to. So the challenge now, or the issue now, before the Federation government and the Federation parliamentarians is whether or not they're going to adopt legislation that will address this critical energy security issue confronting BiH. Of course, there are other benefits to this legislation as well. It'll create a tremendous amount of jobs and the potential for economic growth in Herzegovina, for example. And they have an opportunity to do that. The choice about what they do is obviously theirs. But I'll be honest, I think history is going to judge them and based on how they vote and how they act about whether or not they've decided in the next week or two to support Russia or to support the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
A šta mislite zbog čega se predsjednik HDZ-a gospodin Dragan Čović toliko protivi usvajanju zakona o južnoj interkonekciji u Domu naroda Federalnog parlamenta? Imate li neku poruku za njega?
Well, sure, why not? Thanks for the opportunity to present one. Look, I don't want to repeat everything I just said, but it's clear that there's widespread support in parts of Parliament for adoption of this legislation for all the reasons I just identified. So my first message would be it's time to do the right thing and pass the legislation. But I want to make another observation about it as well. I mean, you put your finger on the problem, Dragan Čović, because we've had conversations with HDZ, BiH officials, you know, in the Federation and in the cantons and elsewhere, and many of them see the benefits of the Southern Interconnector, both in terms of the energy security I've discussed, but also in terms of the vast economic potential it could bring for their communities. And they want to see the legislation as adopted in December 2021 passed. It's Dragan Čović who doesn't want to do that. So, you know, my second message for him, I hope I'm allowed to have more than one, my second message for him would be stop blocking the legislation and stop claiming that it doesn't take into consideration the interests of Croats. I mean, there's some history here that he likes to elide that's a problem, which is, and that he likes to elide it is a problem. The legislation was developed before December 2021, and individuals involved in this included HDZ BiH, and it considered Croat interests at the time, which is why the government in the Federation, which included HDZ BiH, approved it. And then when it went to Parliament, it was voted on and supported by HDZ BiH. And it still considers Croat interests. I mean, in fact, there are steps now, or proposals now to make some changes to the way the project is implemented and managed so that there's greater Croat participation in this. So the notion that this project doesn't take into consideration Croat interests is patently false. Now, does it take into consideration Dragan Čović's interest to want to personally enrich himself or to use the project as a political tool to reward friends and punish enemies? No, it doesn't take into consideration those concerns, and nor should it. So that's my penultimate and most important message, or my most important message is stop blocking this and stop putting your personal interests before the interests of the Croats you claim to represent.
Svjedoci smo da Bosna i Hercegovina nije ispunila i reformsku agendu. Danas je trebalo biti održana sjednica Vijeća ministara, nakon toga komisija koja bi trebala o tome raspravljati. Međutim, ministri iz Republike Srpske su odlučili da bojkotuju sjednicu jer u posjetu Sarajevu sutra na krugu 9.9 će doći kosovski premijer gospodin Albin Kurti. Kako to komentarišete i u kontekstu ove reformske agende, ali i regionalne saradnje koja bi trebala biti između dvije države?
Let me start by saying, you know, since 2003, Bosnia and Herzegovina has had a European perspective. Over that subsequent 22 years, there's been a lot of missed opportunities in BiH, and there's a lot of blame to go around for that. You're talking about the Western Balkans Growth Plan, which is, as you rightly point out, a really important opportunity for Bosnia and Herzegovina. For the first time, the European Union has put on the table the notion that, okay, we're going to bring you into our organization in terms of some of the benefits sooner, even before a session, provided you implement certain types of reforms. The first step is the submission of this reform agenda. Now, that's being blocked because Milorad Dodik objects to two points in this reform agenda, and they're both very important. The first has to do with the Constitutional Court of BiH. The European Union has correctly identified the need to have functional rule of law institutions, and particularly state-level institutions, and in particular the BiH Constitutional Court, which means its rulings need to be respected and implemented throughout the country, which is part of that requirement. And the RSNA needs to do its job, its constitutional duty, and appoint the judges. But Mr. Dodik objects to that. They have also indicated that they want to see some changes to the way decision-making takes place in certain bodies, the State Aid Council and the Competition Council, where they've been clear these decisions need to be taken in line with the acquis, which means they need to be merit-based, not ethnically based. That's right as well, and Mr. Dodik objects to that as well. So in this instance, the blame for the failure to advance the Western Balkans Growth Plan reform agenda rests with Mr. Dodik. As to what needs to happen next, the politicians need to get serious, if they're serious about European Union membership, about implementing the reforms required to move the country forward. And I don't mean reforms that are convenient for them, right? Like the current version of the HDPC law, for example. I mean reforms that meet European and international standards. Transparency International had a press event a couple weeks ago where they pointed out that one of the challenges you have here is as the legislation that the European Union requires as part of its process moves through the drafting stage, the Council of Ministers, the Parliament, it often gets watered down. Or loopholes are created to the benefit of certain political interests. And it varies who those political interests are from time to time. It happened on the public procurement law, it happened on the law on conflict of interest, it happened on the HJPC integrity amendments, it may well happen on the HJPC law based on what we've seen of it. And that means you got to do it all over again because it doesn't meet the standards that are required. And you know, people need to remember, politicians need to remember, and the public needs to remember this too. These laws, you need them not just because the EU says you need them, although that's true. You need them because they're good for the country, right? If you want a prosperous economy, you need the rule of law, right? If you want private sector-led growth, you need a business climate that generates it, right? So these laws benefit the public in the immediate term, even as you progress over the years into the European Union. And unfortunately, a lot of the leaders in this country haven't been serious about doing that. They've wanted to either block the process, as you just described, you know, not show up for a meeting for, frankly, petty reasons, or try to carve out an exception for themselves to maintain some privilege so that they can continue to get away with their corrupt behavior, as the case may be. And that's not helpful either. And if that doesn't change, then the offer that the European Union has made to Bosnia and Herzegovina will never be realized.
Evo, promenuli ste korupciju. Kriminal i korupcija su gorući problem Bosne i Hercegovine. Mislite li vi sa postojećom vlasti ili uopšte sa vlasti koja je u proteklih par decenija ovdje u Bosni i Hercegovini da će biti moguće riješiti taj problem?
Corruption is a tremendous problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I was here, I think you know, from 2006 to 2009 as the political counselor at this embassy. Corruption's worse today than it was then. It is a threat to the country's democracy and it's a threat to its future prosperity. The politicians of this country have chosen to focus on enriching themselves rather than enriching their constituents. And if that doesn't change, then there's little hope for a stable, prosperous democracy here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. What'll happen is what we've seen happen over the past 10 or 15 years. People who want to build a future for themselves, their family, and their children and grandchildren here will decide to leave. They may not want to leave. They may have a deep attachment to their community, but they also want to make better lives for themselves, which is a normal human and noble aspiration. So they'll go to Germany, or they'll go to Sweden, or they'll go to the United Kingdom, or they'll go to the United States. And look, the Bosnian and Herzegovinian communities in the United States are thriving. You have wonderful people, incredibly talented, incredibly smart. And on the one hand, to see the United States benefit from their talents is terrific. But it would be much better for the country and its future if they felt they could stay here and do that kind of thing. So corruption is a cancer. And, you know, like any cancer, if it's not treated, in this case addressed, people are held accountable, it'll kill the patient.
Sjedinjene Američke Države su dosta novca uložile i u reformu odbrane Bosne i Hercegovine. Međutim, put ka NATO ide prilično sporo. Kako to komentarišete?
Well, let me start by making a very important observation up front. The United States strongly supports the aspirations that Bosnia and Herzegovina has for becoming a member of the alliance, and we have for many years. It's enshrined in your own defense law of 2005. But joining NATO is about more than aspirations. It's about hard work. It's about reforms. And if you ask me why the process has slowed down, it's because there hasn't been the reforms or the hard work that's necessary to move the ball forward. That's a challenge in the current government, and I've talked about that publicly, but it was a challenge with the last government as well. I mean, there's nobody who can stand up in Parliament, in government or in the opposition, and not be accused of failing to do the necessary things to advance BIH's NATO aspirations. So we need to see things like reform of the human resource system, reform of procurement systems, steps that are taken to make I say the lives, but facilities and others better for the men and women who are patriotically serving in your country's armed forces. Those are not sexy reforms, like buying helicopters or considering the purchase of drones, which make headlines. But the backbone of a NATO military is in how it's managed, in how its people are cared for, in its structure, in all of those things that nobody sees, that aren't visible. And there needs to be a tremendous amount of work done there. The reform program needs to be depoliticized, right? And wait for it, when you pass a reform program, you need to implement it, right? If it just sits on a shelf gathering dust, it's of little value. The 2016 Defense Review is doing just that. Very little has been done to implement the 2016 Defense Review, and that's an 8-year-old document, right? My government is committed to working with leaders in the armed forces and in the Ministry of Defense who want to see this change. And we've seen a little in recent weeks. There's been some steps taken to address some of the human resource problems I identified and to deal with the excess ammunition and weapons, and that's great, but it's still not enough. You know, and we're committed to making, not just rhetorically, but to making concrete investments into the armed forces of BIH. During my time here, we've invested $50 million into the armed forces of BIH. I would argue there is no stronger or more committed partner to the armed forces of this country than the United States of America. And I want to say one other thing, because it doesn't get said enough. I've met with the men and women who serve in BIH's armed forces. They're impressive, right? They get a lot done with a little, both in terms of the resources they need to do their job and the support they should be getting from the political leadership of this country. And I think everybody in this country should be proud of their patriotism and their service to BIH.
Želim da vam postavim jedno pitanje vezano za pobjedu gospodina Donalda Trumpa na američkim izborima. Njegovu pobjedu u jednom dijelu Bosne i Hercegovine su slavili, dok u drugom dijelu Bosne i Hercegovine nije baš primljena sa oduševljenjem. Odmah je nakon toga iz američke ambasade jasno poslana poruka kako bez obzira koja stranka i koji predsjednik bude u Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama, da se stav Sjedinjenih Američkih Država neće mijenjati prema Bosni i Hercegovini, dakle suverenitet na prvom mjestu. Koja bi vaša poruka u tom smislu bila građanima Bosne i Hercegovine?
Well, that's a very fair question, right? I mean, American elections are important globally. They're certainly important in the United States of America. and everyone is interested in what happens next. Now, A, I can't predict the future, but B, it's also inappropriate for me to begin to try to speculate or comment on the policies of an administration that's not yet in office. We still have some time between now and January 20th. Having said that, I do think it's really important to underscore that United States policy for the last 30 years has been bipartisan, supported by both Republicans and Democrats. Presidents Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump in his first administration, and of course Biden. And that is to support the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to see the country integrated into Euro-Atlantic institutions. Those core strategic objectives for 30 years have guided U.S. policy under Republicans and under Democrats. I don't think that's going to change.
I na kraju da vas pitam, jeste li zadovoljni urađenim onim što ste postigli tokom vašeg mandata ovdje u Bosni i Hercegovini? Mislite li da bi je moglo možda bolje ili ne?
Well, look, I still have some time to go. I think it's a little premature to start assessing my mandate. I'm not sure I'm the right person to assess my mandate either. I'm sure there'll be lots of opinions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, some of them already expressed about my mandate. But I think it's worth focusing a little bit on what we're trying to do here. I go back to what I said earlier about the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and multi-ethnic character and integration of this country into Euro-Atlantic institutions. That's been at the core of what I do every day, and it's been at the core of what this embassy does every day. When we get up in the morning and come to work, that's what's on our minds. That's our core objective. And in that context, we've tried to do some things to strengthen state-level institutions. Not because we're trying to create a unitary BIH. That's not the context in which a BIH can thrive, given its history. But because state-level institutions need the capacity to be able to lead the country into Euro-Atlantic institutions, whether that's the armed forces of BIH, where I mentioned the $50 million investment we've made, rule of law institutions, where we're continuing to make investments to try to strengthen the rule of law and the fight against corruption, which, as we pointed out earlier, it's difficult, it's hard, but it's necessary work. I've also, I have a personal interest in, and I've tried to focus on reconciliation as well. I think we need to be honoring, and I've tried to honor myself, all the civilian victims of the 1992 to 1995 war. Bosniak, Croat, Serb, other. When any innocent civilian dies, we should all be prepared to honor them and to memorialize them. I'm very proud of the work that we've done with the Srebrenica Počičari Memorial Center. They have a really critical mission, not just to serve as a final resting place for the victims of that horrible genocide, but to document it. And they've done tremendous work at the museum there and with the archives, and also to educate, to combat genocide denial, and to ensure that the world knows about this, so we don't forget, so it doesn't happen again. And I think that's important. The United States, I believe, has been, and I think remains, the strongest partner and advocate of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It has been for the last 30 years and remains so. And we are going to stand by this country as you move towards NATO, as you move towards the EU, and when we're going to help work with the institutions of this country and the individuals in this country to make that journey possible. That's been a steadfast commitment of my country and of the team that I lead here in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Gospodine Marfi, hvala vam što ste govorili za Radio Slobodna Evropa.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.